The year 1892 draped itself over the cobbled streets of Oakhaven, a village nestled deep within the verdant, mist-shrouded valleys of rural England, like a heavy, damp woolen blanket. It was a year of gaslight flickering against encroaching shadows, of steam engines chugging across the landscape, and of minds grappling with the dizzying pace of scientific discovery. Yet, for all its advancements, Oakhaven remained stubbornly tethered to ancient rhythms, its inhabitants more attuned to the turning of seasons and the tolling of the church bell than to the grand pronouncements from London's learned societies. It was in this anachronistic pocket of the world that Alara Vance, a child barely 10 years old, found herself burdened with a perception that defied every known law of physics and every whispered prayer. She saw time, not as a linear progression of moments, but as a vast, shimmering tapestry woven with threads of light and shadow, constantly shifting, constantly whispering. Alara's earliest memories were not of her mother's gentle lullabies, or the scent of her father's pipe tobacco, but of the peculiar distortions that clung to people and objects. As a toddler, she'd point at the family's grandfather clock, not at its ornate face, but at the faint, swirling aura that emanated from its pendulum, a spectral echo of every tick it had ever made, and a shimmering premonition of every tick yet to come. Her parents, bless their pragmatic hearts, dismissed it as a child's vivid imagination, a fanciful interpretation of light and dust motes. They were good, simple folk. Her father, Thomas Vance, a diligent carpenter whose hands were perpetually stained with sawdust and honest toil. Her mother, Eleanor, a woman of quiet strength and endless patience, whose days revolved around the rhythm of the hearth and the mending basket. They loved Alara fiercely, but their world was one of tangible realities, of wood and wool, of sunrise and sunset. The ethereal realm Alara inhabited was beyond their comprehension, a silent chasm between their understanding and her unique reality. As Alara grew, so too did the intensity of her temporal perceptions. It began subtly, with a faint haze around objects that had seen much use, the smooth, worn handle of the kitchen door, the polished surface of the dining table, each imbued with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of its past interactions. She could feel the echoes of countless hands turning the knob, the weight of forgotten meals settled upon the wood. But then the distortions began to bleed into the future. A fleeting shimmer around her father's saw before it snagged on a knot, a brief, chilling ripple in the air before a teacup slipped from her mother's grasp. These were not clear visions, not cinematic scenes playing out before her eyes. Instead, they were sensory impressions, a sudden, inexplicable chill in a warm room, a fleeting scent of rain before the first drop fell, a discordant hum that vibrated in her bones. It was like living within a perpetual, subtle echo chamber where the past and future were never truly silent. Her classmates at the village school found her odd. While they giggled over skipping ropes and whispered secrets about boys, Alara would often stare blankly at the blackboard, not because she was daydreaming, but because the chalk dust, suspended in the air, seemed to carry the faint, ghostly outlines of lessons from years past, overlaid with the shimmering potential of future equations yet to be written. The teacher, Miss Agnes Finch, a woman of stern countenance but underlying kindness, often found Alara's attention wandering. her gaze fixed on something unseen. "Ilara, are you with us, child?" she would ask, her voice cutting through the temporal hum that only Ilara perceived. Ilara would blink, her eyes the color of deep forest moss, refocusing on the present, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. How could she explain that the very air around Miss Finch pulsed with the echoes of countless lectures, and that a faint, shimmering crack was already forming in the leg of her favorite wooden desk, a precursor to its eventual splintering? Themi. Most unsettling manifestations occurred when Ilara encountered strong emotions or significant events. When the village baker, Mr. Abernathy, lost his wife to a sudden fever, the grief that enveloped him was not just a present sorrow. To Ilara, it manifested as a dense, suffocating cloud of purple-black energy that clung to him, swirling with the echoes of shared laughter and whispered endearments, and a faint, terrifying shimmer of the moment of his wife's last breath. It was overwhelming, a cacophony of temporal noise that made her physically ill. She would retreat to her room, burying her face in her pillow, trying to muffle the relentless, invisible stream of time that flowed through her. Her mother, mistaking her distress for sensitivity, would bring her warm milk and sit by her bedside, stroking her hair, oblivious to the true nature of her daughter's suffering. One crisp autumn afternoon, as leaves the color of burnt umber danced in the wind, Ilara was walking home from school. She passed the old mill, its colossal water wheel long since fallen silent, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of years. As she drew near, a powerful wave of temporal energy washed over her, far more intense than anything she had experienced before. The air around the mill shimmered violently, not with faint echoes, but with vivid, almost tangible impressions. She saw with startling clarity the mill in its prime. The roar of the river, the rhythmic clatter of the machinery, the dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight, the hearty laughter of the millers. It was as if she had stepped through a veil, directly into the past. But then the vision shifted, fracturing into a kaleidoscope of possibilities. She saw the mill crumbling, its roof collapsing under heavy snow. She saw it repurposed, perhaps as a grand residence. She even saw a fleeting, unsettling image of it engulfed in flames, a terrifying orange glow against a night sky. The sheer volume of information, the conflicting temporal streams, sent a jolt through her small body. She stumbled, clutching her head, a sharp pain lancing behind her eyes. A gruff voice startled her back to the present. "Watch where you're going, child!" It was Old Man Hemlock, the village's reclusive herbalist, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes sharp and surprisingly knowing. He was known for his strange concoctions and his even stranger pronouncements, often dismissed as the ramblings of a hermit. He stood by the roadside, a wicker basket filled with foraged roots and herbs slung over his arm, observing her with an unnerving intensity. Ilara, still disoriented, mumbled an apology. Hemlock, however, did not move. He simply continued to stare, his gaze seeming to pierce through her, beyond the surface of her skin, into the very core of her being. "The Chronos whispers to you, little one," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Be wary of its song. It promises much, but demands more." He then turned abruptly and shuffled away, disappearing into the deepening shadows of the lane, leaving Alara trembling, not just from the temporal shock, but from the unsettling realization that someone finally had seen a glimpse of her unseen world. The encounter with Old Man Hemlock left an indelible mark on Alara. His words, "The Chronos whispers to you," echoed in her mind, giving a name, however cryptic, to the swirling, shimmering reality that had always been hers alone. She began to observe him from a distance, noticing the way he seemed to move with an almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings, as if he too perceived a layer of reality invisible to others. Was he like her? Did he also hear the whispers of time? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, Alara felt a flicker of hope that she was not entirely alone in her peculiar existence. Yet, the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. The mill incident had been a stark reminder of the overwhelming nature of her ability. She was a small boat adrift on a vast, unpredictable ocean of time, with no rudder, no sail, and no chart. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, and Alara knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she could not ignore them much longer. The fabric of time, it seemed, was beginning to unravel, and she, Alara Vance, was inextricably caught in its threads. The days following Alara's encounter with Old Man Hemlock were a blur of heightened sensory input and profound introspection. His words, "The Chronos whispers to you, little one," had not only given a name to her inexplicable ability, but had also ignited a desperate need for understanding. The isolation of her unique perception had been a heavy burden, a silent, invisible wall between herself and the rest of the world. Now, a crack had appeared in that wall, offering a tantalizing glimpse of a shared reality, or at least, a shared understanding. Old Man Hemlock, the village eccentric, was no longer just a figure of whispered tales and strange smells. He was a potential key, a living enigma who might hold the answers to her bewildering existence. Alara began to seek him out, not directly, for she was still a child wary of the unknown, but subtly. She would linger near the edges of the ancient woods where his ramshackle cottage stood, a dwelling half hidden by overgrown brambles and gnarled oak trees, its chimney perpetually exhaling thin wisps of fragrant smoke, a mix of wood fire and the pungent aroma of his herbal concoctions. She observed him from behind thickets of hawthorn, watching as he moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic grace, his gnarled hands plucking leaves and roots with an uncanny precision. There was a quiet dignity to his solitude, a profound connection to the earth that Alara, with her own connection to time, found strangely compelling. The temporal echoes around him were different from others. They were less chaotic, more like a deep, resonant hum, as if his own life was perfectly aligned with the flow of the Chronos. One afternoon, driven by an unbearable curiosity and a growing sense of urgency, Alara found herself standing at the edge of his overgrown garden, the faint scent of mint and damp earth filling the air. Old Man Hemlock was bent over a patch of belladonna, his back to her. She hesitated, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What would she say? How could she explain the shimmering visions, the discordant hum, the overwhelming sense of past and future that constantly assailed her? Before she could formulate a single coherent thought, he straightened, turning slowly to face her. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a startling clarity, as if they saw not just her, but the very fabric of time that clung to her. The whispers. "Grow louder, do they not, child?" he rasped, his voice devoid of surprise, as if he had been expecting her all along. Alara could only nod, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and relief. "Come," he beckoned, a single gnarled finger pointing towards his cottage. "There are things we must discuss before the tapestry unravels completely." Inside, the cottage was a chaotic symphony of nature and knowledge. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, rustling softly in the faint breeze that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Books, their spines cracked and faded, were stacked precariously on every surface, alongside strange glass vials filled with bubbling liquids and polished stones that seemed to glow with an inner light. The air was thick with the scent of earth, arcane spices, and something else, something ancient and indefinable. Hemlock gestured to a small, rickety stool by a crackling hearth. Alara sat, her gaze sweeping across the room, absorbing every detail. The temporal echoes here were immense. A swirling vortex of countless lives lived within these walls, of countless remedies brewed, of countless secrets whispered to the silent stones. Hemlock settled into a worn armchair opposite her, his gaze unwavering. "You see the threads, Alara Vance," he began, his voice softer now, almost mournful. "The threads of the Chronos. Most see only the single strand of their present moment. But you perceive the entire loom." He explained, in a language that was both poetic and profoundly unsettling, that her ability was not a curse, but a rare and potent gift, a connection to the fundamental essence of time itself. He spoke of ancient orders, of forgotten knowledge, of individuals throughout history who had possessed similar, though rarely as intense, perceptions. He called them Chronos seers, individuals whose minds were attuned to the temporal vibrations of the universe. "But it is a gift that comes with a heavy price," he warned, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "The Chronos is a powerful, untamed force. It shows you possibilities, not certainties. The future is a river with many currents, and each choice, each action, creates ripples that can alter its course. To see too much, to know too much, can be a burden that crushes the spirit." He spoke of the temporal sickness, a malady that afflicted those who could not reconcile the overwhelming influx of past and future, leading to madness or a complete withdrawal from reality. Alara recognized the symptoms he described: the headaches, the nausea, the overwhelming sense of disorientation. She had been teetering on the edge of that precipice for years. Then, he spoke of his own connection to the Chronos. He did not possess Ilara's vivid perceptions, but he was an echo-listener, able to discern the faint reverberations of significant temporal events, particularly those that threatened the balance of time itself. He explained that the unraveling he had mentioned at the mill was not just a metaphor. He had felt it, a growing discord in the temporal hum, a subtle but alarming shift in the natural flow. "Something is stirring, child," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Something that seeks to manipulate the Chronos, to bend its threads to its own will. And your gift, Ilara, makes you uniquely sensitive to its presence." He described a shadowy, elusive entity, or perhaps a group, that had been subtly interfering with the natural progression of events, creating small, almost imperceptible paradoxes that over time could lead to catastrophic temporal instability. He called them Chronos Weavers, though he admitted he knew little of their true nature or their ultimate goals. Their actions were like tiny tears in the fabric of time, and Alara's heightened senses were picking up the vibrations of these tears. The mill incident, he explained, was a localized manifestation of this larger temporal disturbance, a place where the threads had become particularly tangled. The conflicting futures she had witnessed were not just possibilities, but the result of subtle manipulations, attempts to steer the mill's fate in different directions. "You are not merely seeing time, Ilara," Hemlock concluded, his voice grave. "You are sensing the distortions, the unnatural bends in its flow. And because you can perceive these distortions, you may also be able to mend them." He then presented her with a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried moss, lay a single, iridescent crystal, pulsating with a faint internal light. "This is a Chronos stone," he explained. "It will not block the whispers, but it will help you to filter them, to focus your perception, and perhaps to learn to navigate the currents of time without being swept away." He instructed her on how to meditate with the stone, to quiet her mind and allow the stone's energy to harmonize with her own. He also warned her against revealing her abilities to anyone else, especially not to the men of science who would seek to exploit her, or the men of power who would seek to control her. Over the next few weeks, Ilara visited Old Man Hemlock regularly, learning from him the delicate art of temporal perception. He taught her how to differentiate between the natural echoes of the past and the artificial ripples of manipulation. He showed her how to listen to the future, not just see its possibilities, but to discern the subtle shifts that indicated interference. The Chronos stone became an extension of her being, its cool weight a constant comfort in her palm. With its aid, the cacophony of temporal noise began to subside, replaced by a more organized, albeit still complex, symphony. She learned to focus on specific threads, to trace their origins, and to perceive the points where they had been subtly altered. One evening, as the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the village, Ilara was meditating with the Chronos stone in her small room. Suddenly, a sharp, jarring discord pierced through the temporal hum. It was unlike anything she had felt before, a violent tearing sensation in the fabric of time itself. She saw not a clear vision, but a blinding flash of emerald green light, followed by a chilling sense of profound displacement. It was distant, far beyond Oakhaven, but undeniably significant. Hemlock's words echoed in her mind. "Something is stirring." This was not a subtle ripple. This was a deliberate, powerful intervention. The whispers had become a scream, and Ilara knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the unraveling had begun. Her gift, once a solitary burden, now felt like a desperate call to action. The Chronos was not just whispering, it was crying out for help. The blinding flash of emerald green light, followed by that chilling sense of profound displacement, left Elara gasping for air in the confines of her small, moonlit room. The Chronos stone, clutched tightly in her hand, pulsed erratically, mirroring the frantic beat of her heart. This was not a ripple, not a subtle bend in the temporal fabric. This was a violent, deliberate tear, a wound in the very essence of time that resonated with a terrifying, silent scream. The hum that usually accompanied her perceptions had ceased, replaced by a deafening void, a temporal silence more unsettling than any cacophony. It was the sound of something being erased, or perhaps something being violently rewritten. She scrambled from her bed, her legs trembling, and stumbled towards the window. Oakhaven slept, oblivious. The gaslights flickered lazily, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her urgent terror. How could they not feel it? How could the world remain so serenely ignorant while the very foundation of its existence was being violently disturbed? Hemlock's words, "Something is stirring, something that seeks to manipulate the Chronos," echoed with a chilling new clarity. This wasn't a distant threat anymore. It felt immediate, palpable, even if its origin was far beyond the familiar valleys of Oakhaven. Without a second thought, Elara pulled on her simple dress and sturdy boots. The cool night air bit at her exposed skin, but she barely registered it. Her mind was a whirlwind of frantic questions and a singular, desperate need. She had to find Hemlock. He was the only one who understood, the only one who could explain this terrifying new development. She slipped out of the house, a shadow among shadows, and ran towards the ancient woods, the Chronos stone a warm, insistent weight in her palm. The path, usually familiar, felt alien underfoot, as if the very ground had subtly shifted, disoriented by the temporal shockwave. She found Old Man Hemlock not in his cottage, but standing by the ancient, gnarled oak that marked the boundary of his property. He was staring up at the sky, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the distant horizon. As Elara approached, she saw the lines of worry etched deeper into his already weathered face. His eyes, usually sharp, seemed distant, fixed on something unseen. "You felt it," he stated, his voice a low rumble, devoid of question. He didn't turn to her, his gaze still fixed on the unseen temporal disturbance. A profound rupture, not a mere distortion, but a deliberate erasure, a moment, a significant moment has been plucked from the Chronos, leaving a void. Elara's breath hitched. "Erased? How? What was it?" Hemlock finally turned, his gaze meeting hers, and in them, Elara saw a profound weariness, a knowledge of burdens too heavy for one man to bear. "The Chronos Weavers," he murmured, his voice laced with a grim certainty. "Their audacity grows. They have not merely altered a thread, they have severed one completely. The emerald flash you saw, that was the signature of their most potent temporal device, a tool capable of unmaking moments." He explained that such an act was unprecedented in its scale and danger. Smaller paradoxes he could sense and sometimes even guide others to subtly counteract. But a complete erasure? That was a wound that could fester, spreading temporal instability like a disease. But what was erased? Alara pressed, her voice trembling. What moment? Hemlock closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his lips. That is the insidious nature of it, child. When a moment is truly erased, its echoes fade, its ripples vanish. The Chronos itself struggles to remember it. My echo listening can only detect the void it left behind, the profound absence. But I can tell you this. It was a moment of great significance, a pivotal point in the past, likely within the last century. Its removal has created a temporal vacuum, and the Chronos is already trying to fill it, desperately weaving new, unstable threads to compensate. He then led her into his cottage, the air inside now heavy with a palpable sense of urgency. He pulled out an ancient, leather-bound tome, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. Its title, etched in faded gold, read, The Labyrinth of Time. This is not a book of history, Alara, he explained, carefully turning its pages. It is a record of temporal anomalies, of shifts and disturbances felt by Chronos seers and echo listeners throughout the ages. It speaks of the Chronos weavers, though their true origins remain shrouded in mystery. They are said to be a clandestine order, obsessed with perfecting the present by meticulously pruning the past. They believe they can create a perfect timeline, free of what they deem mistakes or inefficiencies. Hemlock's voice grew colder. But they are fools. The Chronos is not a garden to be pruned. It is a wild, living entity. Every moment, every choice, every perceived mistake is a vital part of its intricate ecosystem. To remove one is to destabilize the whole. And this latest act, this erasure, it is a declaration of war on the natural order of time. He then showed her a series of intricate diagrams within the book, depicting swirling vortexes and fractured lines, symbols that resonated with the chaotic visions Alara had experienced. The Chronos Stone, he said, tapping the crystal in her hand, can help you to read the void. It will not show you what was, for that is gone, but it can show you the implications of its absence, the new unstable threads the Chronos is weaving to compensate. These are the echoes of the unwritten, the ghost of a future that should have been, now subtly altered. He instructed Alara to hold the stone, to clear her mind, and to focus on the void she had felt. It was a daunting task. The void was not a presence, but an absence, a negative space in the fabric of reality. Yet, as she concentrated, allowing the stone's steady pulse to guide her, faint shimmering images began to coalesce at the edges of her perception. They were fleeting, like reflections on disturbed water, but distinct enough to cause a fresh wave of unease. She saw a grand building, ornate and imposing, but with a strange, almost ethereal quality, as if it existed slightly out of sync with its surroundings. Then, a flash of a different kind of light, not emerald, but a dull metallic gleam, and the sound of distant, muffled explosions. She saw faces, many faces, some filled with hope, others with despair, but they were all indistinct like figures in a dream. The most disturbing image, however, was a fleeting glimpse of a vast, desolate landscape, devoid of life, bathed in an unnatural, sickly green light. It was a future, a potential future that sent a shiver of dread down her spine. "What do you see, child?" Hemlock asked, his voice low. Ilara struggled to articulate the fragmented visions. "A building, very grand but not quite real, explosions, many people, and a terrible, empty place. Green light." Hemlock nodded slowly, his eyes distant once more. "The Chronos is attempting to rewrite the past to fill the void. The grand building you see is a temporal anomaly, a structure that should not exist, a consequence of the erasure. The explosions, they are echoes of a conflict that should have been, but now might not be, or might be very different. And the desolate landscape? That is a potential future, a grim possibility if the Chronos Weavers succeed in their grand design." He explained that the Chronos Weavers were likely targeting specific historical events, moments they believed were inefficient or unnecessary for their desired future. The challenge for Ilara, and for Hemlock, was to identify the original erased moment by observing the ripple effects it was causing in the present and the potential futures. It was like trying to deduce the shape of a stone dropped into a pond by only observing the expanding circles on the surface. "We must identify the source of this wound, Ilara," Hemlock stated, his voice firm. "And then we must find a way to mend it. The Chronos Stone will be your guide. You must learn to follow the echoes of the unwritten, to trace them back to their point of origin. It will be dangerous. The Weavers will not tolerate interference. They are masters of deception, capable of masking their tracks and manipulating perceptions." He then revealed a map, not of Oakhaven, but of England, intricately drawn on aged parchment. He pointed to a region far to the north, a place of industrial might and burgeoning cities. "The epicenter of the disturbance, I believe, lies here," he said, his finger resting on a spot marked Manchester. "A city of innovation, of rapid change. A perfect canvas for those who seek to reshape destiny." Ilara stared at the map, her gaze fixed on the distant city. Manchester. It was a world away from the quiet, familiar rhythms of Oakhaven, a place of smokestacks and factories, of bustling crowds and relentless progress. The thought of venturing there alone was terrifying. Yet the images of the desolate future, the emerald void, spurred her on. Her gift, once a solitary burden, now felt like a desperate, undeniable calling. The Chronos was not just whispering or crying out, it was demanding action, and Ilara Vance, the girl who could see time, knew she had no choice but to answer. The Yodi journey to Manchester and into the heart of the temporal unraveling had begun. Ilara's journey from Oakhaven to Manchester was a sensory overload, the bustling city a nexus of overwhelming temporal energy. Guided by the Chronos Stone, she sought the source of the temporal disturbance Hemlock had warned her about. Her search led her to a large textile mill, where the air shimmered with intense temporal distortions. Here she saw a phantom image of the grand building from her visions, realizing this mill was the temporal anomaly. Focusing her perception, Ilara discerned that the Chronos Weavers had erased a pivotal moment of labor reform in the mill's past. This movement, had it not been suppressed, would have led to the construction of a workers' guild hall, the grand building she'd seen. The Weaver's goal was to prevent social progress and maintain industrial control, shaping a future that now threatened to become a desolate landscape. Determined, Ilara sought remnants of the stifled movement. Her search led her to a dusty bookshop, where she found a rare pamphlet titled The Worker's Call. The Chronos stone flared, confirming its significance as a direct echo of the erased moment. The shop's owner, Mr. Silas Blackwood, revealed himself to be an echo listener, like Hemlock, drawn to the pamphlet's forgotten knowledge. Ilara realized she had found an unexpected ally. Her next step was to understand the pamphlet and find a way to reignite the suppressed movement before the bleak future became reality. The discovery of the Worker's Call and the unexpected alliance with Mr. Silas Blackwood felt like a beacon in the temporal chaos that had become Ilara's life. The dusty bookshop, once just a quiet haven for forgotten tales, now hummed with a different kind of energy, a subtle resonance of hope and defiance. Mr. Blackwood, a man of quiet demeanor and scholarly habits, proved to be an invaluable resource. His knowledge of local history, combined with his own intuitive connection to the echoes of the unwritten, allowed him to fill in the gaps that Ilara's raw temporal perceptions couldn't quite bridge. He explained that the Worker's Call was indeed a pivotal document, penned by a charismatic, though now largely forgotten, labor organizer named Arthur Finch. Finch, a former mill worker himself, had possessed an uncanny ability to articulate the grievances of the working class and galvanize them into action. The pamphlet was a manifesto outlining plans for a unified workers' union, advocating for fair wages, safer conditions, and the establishment of a workers' guild hall, a place where education, mutual aid, and collective bargaining could flourish, free from the oppressive influence of the mill owners. The movement had been gaining unprecedented momentum in Manchester in the late 1860s, poised to fundamentally alter the city's industrial landscape. It was a moment of true potential, Blackwood mused, his fingers tracing the faded print on the pamphlet's cover. A genuine shift in the balance of power. But then, it simply faded. The meeting stopped, the leaders dispersed, the fervor died. Historians attributed it to internal disagreements or the overwhelming power of the industrialists. But I always felt an absence, a hollow space where something significant should have been. His eyes, behind his spectacles, held a profound sadness, a testament to the weight of the unwritten history he sensed. Ilara, with the Chronos stone pulsing gently in her hand, could now see the precise moment of erasure. It wasn't a single dramatic event, but a series of subtle, insidious manipulations. The Chronos Weavers had targeted key individuals within the movement, subtly altering their decisions, sowing discord, introducing false information, and even, Ilara suspected, orchestrating accidents that removed crucial figures from the scene. The Emerald Flash, she had felt, was likely the culmination of these smaller interventions, the final act of severing the main thread of the movement, ensuring its collapse. The grand building, the Workers' Guild Hall, had been erased before. Its foundations could even be laid. "They didn't just stop the movement, Mr. Blackwood," Ilara explained, her voice hushed. "They unmade it. They took away the very possibility of it succeeding, leaving only faint echoes and a distorted timeline. She described the desolate future she had glimpsed, a world where unchecked industrial power led to a sterile, joyless existence. Blackwood listened intently, his expression grim. "Then our task is clear, Ilara. We must find a way to reignite the spark, to reintroduce the unwritten into the present. But how? The Weavers are subtle, powerful. They will undoubtedly be watching for any attempts to undo their work." Their strategy began with understanding the pamphlet intimately. Ilara spent hours in the bookshop, poring over the workers' call, its words resonating with a renewed power, now that she understood its true historical significance. Blackwood, meanwhile, used his network of contacts, other quiet scholars, sympathetic journalists, and even a few disillusioned former factory managers, to gather information about the current state of labor relations in Manchester. They discovered that while the grand movement had been stifled, the underlying grievances remained. Workers still toiled in dangerous conditions for meager wages, their voices unheard. The ground, though dormant, was fertile for a new seed of rebellion. Their plan was audacious. They would subtly reintroduce the ideas of the workers' call into the public consciousness. Blackwood, with his printing press in the back of his shop, began to meticulously reproduce copies of the pamphlet, making them appear aged and authentic, as if they had simply been rediscovered. Ilara, guided by the chronostone, would then strategically place these pamphlets in locations where their echoes would be strongest. In the hands of sympathetic workers, in the reading rooms of working men's clubs, even slipped anonymously into the mailboxes of influential figures. The chronostone helped her identify individuals who, in the original timeline, would have been receptive to Finch's message, those whose temporal threads still held a faint resonance of the unwritten future. The process was slow, painstaking, and fraught with peril. Each time Ilara placed a pamphlet, she would feel a subtle shift in the temporal hum, a faint strengthening of the unwritten threads. It was like gently nudging a mighty river, hoping to alter its course. But she also felt something else, a growing sense of being watched. The Chronos Weavers, though unseen, were undoubtedly aware of their efforts. The air around her would occasionally prickle with a cold, unnatural stillness, a temporal void that indicated their presence, their subtle attempts to counteract her work. One evening, as Ilara was returning from placing a batch of pamphlets near a large cotton mill, the cold stillness intensified. The gas lights seemed to dim, and the usual street noise faded into an eerie silence. The chronostone in her pocket began to vibrate violently, its light flickering. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows of an alleyway. He was tall, impeccably, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. But it was his eyes that chilled Ilara to the bone. They seemed to absorb the light around them, devoid of warmth or emotion. He moved with an unsettling grace, almost as if he wasn't truly walking but gliding. A curious child, meddling with things best left undisturbed, the figure said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate directly in Ilara's mind, bypassing her ears. The Chronos is not a plaything. Its delicate balance must be maintained. Ilara instinctively clutched the Chronos stone, its protective energy flaring around her. She knew with a terrifying certainty that this was a Chronos weaver, a direct agent of the temporal manipulations. He radiated an aura of immense power, a cold, calculating intelligence. "You seek to undo our work," the weaver continued, stepping closer, his form seeming to waver at the edges, as if he existed slightly out of sync with reality. "A foolish endeavor. The past is immutable. What is done is done. We merely guide it towards its optimal conclusion." "Optimal for whom?" Ilara retorted, surprising herself with her own courage. "Optimal for those who profit from suffering? You call it balance, I call it control." A faint, chilling smile touched the weaver's lips. Such passion, a dangerous trait in one so attuned to the Chronos. It blinds you to the greater good. We eliminate inefficiencies, prevent chaos, ensure stability. The future we build is one of order, of progress unimpeded by petty squabbles. He raised a hand, and Ilara felt a strange pressure in the air, a subtle distortion of time around her. It was as if the moments were stretching, elongating, making her movement sluggish. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if moving through treacle. The weaver was attempting to manipulate her personal timeline, to incapacitate her. But the Chronos stone flared brighter, its warmth spreading through her, counteracting the temporal distortion. Hemlock had taught her to use the stone not just for perception, but for subtle temporal resistance. With a surge of adrenaline, Ilara broke free from the temporal drag, stumbling backward. The weaver paused, a flicker of something akin to surprise in his dark eyes. "An unexpected resistance. The old hermit has taught you well. But you are still a child, and we are many. This is merely a temporary setback." He then dissolved back into the shadows, his form blurring, leaving Ilara trembling but unharmed, the Chronos stone still humming with residual energy. She ran back to Blackwood's shop, bursting through the door, breathless and shaken. Blackwood, who had been poring over an old map, looked up, his expression instantly concerned. "What happened, child?" I felt a ripple, a distinct temporal signature. Ilara recounted the encounter, her voice still trembling. "He was a weaver, Mr. Blackwood. He knew about me. He tried to slow me down." Blackwood's face hardened. "As I feared. They are aware. This makes our task infinitely more dangerous. They will not simply observe now. They will actively interfere." He then revealed a hidden compartment beneath his floorboards, pulling out a small, intricately designed clockwork device. It was made of polished brass and gleaming cogs, radiating a faint, steady temporal hum. "This," he explained, "is a temporal resonator. It was crafted by my own mentor, a Chronos seer of great power, who, like Hemlock, dedicated his life to countering the weavers. It can amplify the echoes of the unwritten, making them more potent, more difficult for the weavers to suppress. But it requires a strong temporal anchor, a focal point." He looked at Ilara, his gaze unwavering. "You, Ilara, with your unique connection to the Chronos, are that anchor. We must use this device to broadcast the message of the workers' call, not just through pamphlets, but through the very fabric of time itself. We must make the unwritten future so vibrant, so undeniable, that even the weavers cannot completely erase it. The plan was daring, almost suicidal. It meant openly challenging the Chronos Weavers on their own temporal battlefield. It meant drawing their full attention. The confrontation with the Chronos Weaver had been a chilling prelude, but it only strengthened Elara's resolve. In the hidden chamber beneath Mr. Blackwood's bookshop, the temporal resonator stood ready, a gleaming contraption of brass and intricate clockwork, radiating a subtle, rhythmic hum. Blackwood, his face etched with grim determination, explained their audacious plan: to amplify the echoes of the workers' call, making them resonate through the very fabric of time, reaching minds that the weavers had shielded. They chose a night of heavy rain, hoping the natural atmospheric interference would provide some cover. As Elara placed her hands on the resonator, the Chronos stone clutched tightly in her palm. A surge of energy flowed through her. The device hummed louder, its cogs whirring with an almost organic rhythm. She closed her eyes, focusing on the pamphlet's words, on the hopeful faces of the workers she had glimpsed in the unwritten past, and on the vision of the Grand Workers' Guild Hall. She poured all her will, all her unique temporal perception into the resonator. A wave of shimmering, invisible light emanated from the device, spreading outwards, not just through space, but through time itself. Elara felt the echoes of the workers' call strengthening, becoming clearer, more insistent. She saw faint ripples, spreading across Manchester, touching the minds of sleeping workers, stirring forgotten ideals, planting seeds of inspiration. It was working. The unwritten future was beginning to assert itself. But the Chronos Weavers were not idle. Almost immediately, Elara felt a powerful counter-pressure, a cold, insidious force pushing back against the temporal broadcast. The air in the chamber grew heavy, the resonator's hum faltered, and the shimmering light around it flickered. In her mind's eye, she saw faint, dark tendrils reaching out, attempting to sever the newly strengthened threads, to reimpose the distorted timeline. The weaver she had encountered on the street was among them, his presence a chilling void of emotion. They were attempting to create localized temporal vacuums, pockets of null time designed to absorb and dissipate the resonators. Broadcast. Elara felt her strength waning, the sheer force of their collective will threatening to overwhelm her. A new surge of energy, however, flowed through her from the Chronos stone itself. It was Hemlock's teaching, the subtle art of temporal resistance, now amplified by the stone's inherent power. Elara shifted her focus, not just pushing back, but actively weaving the unwritten threads, strengthening the connections between the pamphlet's ideals and the minds of the people. She saw flashes of workers discussing the pamphlet, their eyes alight with a newfound hope. The faint, shimmering outline of the Workers' Guild Hall grew stronger, more defined. The weavers' countermeasures became more frantic, their attacks more direct. The air crackled, and faint, emerald sparks danced around the resonator. Blackwood, ever vigilant, adjusted the resonator's settings, his brow furrowed with concentration, acutely aware of the unseen battle. Elara pushed her abilities to their absolute limit, her vision blurring, her head throbbing, but her will remained, unbroken. She would not let the unwritten future fade. With a final, desperate surge of will, Ilara poured every ounce of her remaining energy into the temporal resonator. The Chronos stone flared with blinding intensity, and the echoes of the workers' call surged outwards, overwhelming the Weaver's defenses. Ilara saw their network falter, their dark tendrils retracting, their cold, calculating presences dissolving into the temporal void. They were defeated, their attempts to control the Chronos repelled. The immense pressure in the chamber dissipated, and Ilara collapsed, breathless, into Blackwood's waiting arms. The resonator's hum settled into a gentle thrum, its work complete. Over the following weeks, the subtle changes in Manchester became undeniable. The unwritten future, once a faint whisper, began to manifest. Copies of the Workers' Call, now genuinely rediscovered, circulated widely. Workers, inspired by a collective memory they didn't consciously recall, began to organize with renewed vigor. The calls for fair wages and better conditions grew louder, more unified. The shimmering outline of the Workers' Guild Hall began to solidify as plans for its construction were announced, driven by an unexpected surge of public and even some philanthropic support. Ilara, recovering at Blackwood's shop, observed these changes with a profound sense of awe. The desolate future she had glimpsed now seemed distant, replaced by a vibrant, if still challenging, path forward. Her connection to the Chronos remained, but it was no longer a chaotic burden. With the Weavers gone, and the Chronos stone as her guide, she learned to navigate its currents with greater control, understanding that her gift was not just to see time, but to protect its natural flow. Old Man Hemlock, hearing of the changes in Manchester, visited Ilara one last time. He nodded sagely, a faint smile touching his lips. "You have done well, little one. The Chronos breathes easier now, but remember, its tapestry is always being woven. Be vigilant, for the whispers will always be there, guiding those who listen." Ilara Vance, the girl who could see time, had not just saved a historical moment. She had helped restore the very possibility of human agency in the face of temporal manipulation. She understood now that the future was not fixed, but a dynamic interplay of choices and consequences. Her journey had just begun, a quiet guardian of the Chronos, ready to listen for the whispers and to fight for the unwritten possibilities of tomorrow.